Good evening. Good evening. My name is Michael Hunter Schwartz, and I'm the Dean of the Law School. And I want to welcome both those who are in person and those who are sharing the evening with us online. Thank you so much for being here. I know one thing about all of you is that you feel a lot of the same love that I feel for the Landsbergs. And so I've spent the last few days thinking about why I adore these people so much. And it's a lot of things. I think that they may be the parents that all of us wish we had had. That might be the thing for me. I've been here now for 5.5 years as Dean of the Law School, and from the first minute, of course, Dorothy was in my office coaching me on how to do my job better. And she was, as we all know, actually right about all of her advice. So it's really been a joy for me. And so the opportunity to celebrate people that I care about so much and value so much and I'm so grateful for, I just actually feel lucky to be able to share this evening with you. So welcome, and I look forward to the evening. It's my honor to introduce our featured speakers. Judge Kim Mueller is the Chief Judge and has been so since January 2020. She's been a district judge since December of 2010. She was formerly a magistrate judge, which she did for 8 years. She handled many prisoner civil rights and habeas cases, among many other things. When she was in law school at Stanford, she did a judicial externship with District Judge David Levine and wrote a note focusing on the district's prisoner civil rights caseload and considering many different kinds of management options. She's taught federal courts for us here at McGeorge in the past as an adjunct professor, and I'm hoping it'll be a role she will increase in over the next few years. She currently presides over a long-running civil rights class action now in the remedial phase, brought on behalf of California prisoners requiring constitutionally adequate mental health care. One little-known fact is that she has in common with Brian and Dorothy that they have a daughter who attended Grinnell College, and actually, I have a daughter who attended Grinnell College, and it's not that big of a college, so that's a very unusual thing. And they have a daughter who attended Pomona College, which Judge Mueller also attended. And I will just add that a great pleasure of my time at McGeorge is getting to know Judge Mueller, who I just so much enjoy. And it's amazing that she's not a McGeorge alum because she's incredibly supportive of the law school, for which I'm very grateful. Brian Landsberg. Professor Emeritus Brian Landsberg began teaching at McGeorge in 1986 and has continued to teach since taking emeritus status. Brilliant guy, great teacher, terrible at retirement. His teaching is grounded in his experience as an attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, beginning in the tumultuous 1960s. His career in the Civil Rights Division began with trial work to vindicate the rights of African Americans in Alabama to vote. That work became the basis for his book, Free at Last to Vote, The Alabama Origins of the Voting Rights Act. His work on the cases that transformed the schools of the Deep South from the most segregated to the most integrated schools in the nation by the mid-1970s informed his new book, the one we're going to be hearing about today, Revolution by Law, the Federal Government, and the Desegregation of Alabama Schools. He argued cases in the United States Courts of Appeal throughout the country, as well as working on Supreme Court briefs in seminal civil rights cases. Professor Landsberg's teaching has covered a wide range of public law and advocacy topics, including constitutional law, First Amendment law, federal courts, federal anti-discrimination law, civil rights law, critical race theory, appellate advocacy, and courses for students in our advanced degree programs. He has continued to promote civil rights as co-chair of the amicus committee of the Lawyers Committee for the Civil Rights Under Law, a national organization of lawyers founded at the request of President Kennedy to provide legal representation on important issues of race discrimination. He is also co-chair of the Sacramento Davis chapter of J Street, a national pro-Israel, pro-peace organization. Please join me in welcoming two absolutely lovable people to the podium.
Thank you, Dean, so very much. I appreciate those kind words, and it's been such a pleasure to get to know you and work with you and your entire school these last several years. And congratulations on renewal of your contract. I'm glad you'll be around for a while yet. It is one of the blessings of my life to have gotten to know the Landsbergs fairly early on in my time in Sacramento and to cross paths with them periodically and to be seated here with Brian as we head towards a really big birthday later this month. I don't know if we're going to celebrate that tonight, but I'm glad to be here with you, Brian, and with you, Dorothy, and to see at least one of your daughters in the audience as well. So you really have to read the book, if you haven't, to get the full story. But we're going to try to give you a flavor of it in about half an hour. We're going to leave 5 minutes for questions. And we're going to cover a series of things to just give you a flavor of what this book is all about, this really important book. It does tell the story of the case of Lee v. Macon County, Alabama, Board of Education, for which Brian Landsberg had more than a front row seat. He was in the middle of the fray. The case came after Brown v. Board, at which point African-American parents in Macon County were agitating, losing patience. We all know now that all deliberate speed was not fast enough, and they knew it better than anyone. The political leaders in the South were throwing up every imaginable hurdle, delaying matters, of finding ways to not comply. Government lawyers, including Brian Landsberg, had shown up in voting rights cases and were playing an increasingly central role in supporting the community and affecting change. And the rest is history, a really important history that Brian aims to record properly in this book. So Brian, first I want to talk about the racial caste system, which you explain as a backdrop to the Lee case. You devote significant space in the book talking about it. And could you just help us understand what you mean by racial caste system?
Sure. Well, it's really the cultural and legal hierarchy with whites on top and African Americans on the bottom that began in 1619 and were embodied in the Alabama Constitution in 1901. It reached all aspects of life in the Deep South.
And how are the segregated schools essential to that system?
If I could read you a little bit from my book about that.
All the better.
The racial caste system rested on three legs: political, economic, and social. Education was closely linked to all three. Educated blacks were more likely to vote and even run for political office. Lack of education consigned blacks to rely on whites economically as sharecroppers and servants. Segregated schools reinforced social separation, a cornerstone of the racial caste system seen to benefit whites.
And you expound on how this is an important backdrop. We know, almost all of us in this room, lived through some of that history. I see more gray heads out there. But for those of you who don't have our kind of wisdom, no doubt you have heard the history of the South, and some of what you read in the book will resonate with you. You also talk about the African American community and different components of that community. And I think it would be helpful for all of us to understand whether or not the community was unified in its vision for dismantling the racial caste system.
I think the answer has got to be yes and no. It was very unified in wanting the end of racial caste system. They weren't entirely in agreement on how to go about doing it. I do think that they were all in agreement that equal educational opportunity would be a prerequisite to equality.
But there were two streams of thought, correct?
That's right. There was the so-called Booker T. Washington school of thought that African Americans needed to be on their own and progress on their own, and W.B. Du Bois took a more aggressive stance. But I think that was a little bit that distinction is a little overdrawn. Actually, for example, Booker T. Washington secretly financed voting rights cases, even though he didn't publicly espouse voting rights.
And the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, was in Macon County, and so was a locus of thought and African American attention to education and self-improvement. But the voting rights and litigation school of thought is really what came to the fore in the Lee case, and that dismantling the system became a goal of the Department of Justice under Presidents Kennedy and then Johnson. And we'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But first, you heard reference to the voting rights cases, and voting rights cases actually helped form a foundation for the school desegregation cases. And I think we should spend just a few moments helping folks understand how that was so.
Well, first of all, one of the first places where the Department of Justice was called on to bring voting cases was in Macon County because Tuskegee was there. A large number of African Americans were highly educated, tried to register to vote, were turned down. So the Department of Justice brought suits in Macon County, got to know the African Americans in the county, including the head of the African American organization there, the Tuskegee Civic Association, whose name was Dr. C.G. Gomillion. And so when the Civic Association turned to education, the Department of Justice wasn't far behind.
I love the name Gomillion, and he actually taught at Tuskegee, right?
He taught at Tuskegee, and he brought a very famous voting rights case about racial gerrymandering in Tuskegee.
Yeah. Gomillion v. Lightfoot
Yes.
is the case, so you can look that up when you have the time. And who was the attorney again that he used?
The attorney, his name was Fred Gray. So Fred Gray was the lawyer for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and for Rosa Parks. He was a young lawyer at the time. He had been sent to a law school courtesy of the state of Alabama. He had been sent north because they wouldn't accept him at the University of Alabama Law School because he was African American. So the state of Alabama had to pay his tuition at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And so Fred Gray became the lawyer for the Tuskegee Civic Association.
And we'll talk a bit more about him, really important player. Martin Luther King referred to him as the lawyer for the civil rights movement, counsel to the civil rights movement. You also talk a bit about how judges got educated. And there was a key judge we're going to talk a bit more about, but who was the judge in Macon County?
The federal judge was a man named Frank M. Johnson. He was appointed by President Eisenhower. So he was a Republican in the Democratic South. He actually was from a county, Winston County, Alabama, which was the only Republican county in the state. It had seceded from Alabama during the Civil War. It was called the Free State of Winston during the Civil War. And so he had been the United States Attorney in Birmingham, and then he was appointed to be a judge in Montgomery, Alabama. He was the only federal judge there. And so all cases from Macon County came before his court.
So you couldn't really accuse the parties of forum shopping, of judge shopping. He was the only judge in the Middle District of Alabama, but he turned out to be critical in the Lee case and the development of civil rights law. Just a giant. Some of you know that, but if you have not read about Judge Frank Johnson, he is worth considering and studying. So let's turn to the Lee case. And you particularly have explained to me that it's important to understand the trajectory of that case. So just to review again, we're post-Brown v. Board. The parents are petitioning for the promise of Brown to be fulfilled. They've exhausted their efforts through the local school board. Elected leaders are actively seeking ways to maintain segregation. No local school board in the state would comply with Brown without a court order. One strategy that was followed was called the pupil placement system, feature of the racial caste system. It was put in place to provide facially neutral standards like performance and moral character, but applied in a way to keep students in separate schools. The federal government role had focused primarily on law enforcement. Truman was actually more forceful, but Eisenhower and Kennedy, even in the early years, focused on enforcing the law, respecting the courts, not necessarily embracing desegregation wholesale. You think about cases like Little Rock and Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. The goal was enforcing the law, allowing the law to be followed. But the Lee case, as Brian explains in the book, represents an evolution in the law of desegregation and the federal government's role. And so we want to take you through some key points in that case to give you a sense of why it's so important to understand in detail. So just to review again, when the case was originally filed, it was January 1963. So who filed it? What did it seek?
Right, so I'd like to just preface this by saying that 2 weeks before Fred Gray filed this suit on behalf of 16 African-American high school students, George Wallace was inaugurated as the governor of Alabama. And he gave a speech, but I just want to quote from a little bit. "Today I have stood where Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate then that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum of freedom, as have our generations of forebears before us done, time and again through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So 2 weeks after that, Fred Gray didn't agree. And so he filed the suit on behalf of Detroit Lee, and his wife, and who was the parents of Anthony Lee, and 15 other parents and children, seeking an order against the Macon County School District to desegregate.
So single school district, discrete
Exactly.
set of students, 8 families involved. But at some point, the nature of the suit starts to change. And when was that about and why?
Well, first of all, I should say, so the Judge Johnson, when the suit was filed, asked the Department of Justice to enter the case as a friend of the court and as a party. There was no statutory authority for the Department of Justice to do this at the time, but it did join the case because Judge Johnson issued this order, and so it was part of the case, and so the court ordered desegregation. After the court ordered desegregation, the enrollment at the high school, the white high school, plummeted. And so the State Board of Education, which was basically run by Governor Wallace, ordered the high school shut down. And so Fred Gray recalled, and I'm going to read once more. I'm not going to do this a lot, but Gray recalled, I concluded that if Wallace, as governor of Alabama, had the authority under state law to close down a public school to prevent integration, then he must have the authority to use that same state power to further integration in all of the public elementary and secondary schools in Alabama. Gray said, the realization hit me like the burning bush speaking to Moses, that if the governor had the power to close down a school in Macon County, he should be compelled to use that same power to integrate all of the school systems in Alabama, which were not already then under court order.
So but it's pretty quickly that Gray actually brings an emergency motion. He files in January. Judge Johnson rules in August of 1963, and he's still focused on Macon County at that point.
Yes.
And the school says, okay, we've identified 13 of a total of 48 students that are approved to attend Tuskegee High School. And so the plaintiffs were on their way to prevailing in this critical time, August 1963. And then, because of the turn of events, the DOJ files a new suit.
Right, because on the opening day of school in Alabama, there were actually 4 school systems that were supposed to desegregate under court order. And Governor Wallace sent state troopers to all 4 school systems. And in Tuskegee, they actually they boarded the school bus as it pulled up to Tuskegee High to drop off the African American students. The troopers got on and read an executive order that Governor Wallace had issued, banning them from entering the school. And so they told them they couldn't come in, and they turned the bus around. And so the United States brought a case, and he did the same thing in Montgomery and Mobile and Huntsville as well. And so the United States brought a suit to stop him from interfering with the school desegregation orders.
And they sued him both as governor and as a member of the State Board of Education.
That's right.
Yeah.
And all 5 judges in Alabama at the time from 3 different judicial districts sat together and issued the order that we sought.
So Judge Johnson, it makes me wonder about the power of a federal judge, and I'm one. He appoints the Department of Justice without any statutory authority. He convenes a 5-judge court, and later he admits there's no basis for a 5-judge court. He was making it up as he went along, but he was responding to the moment and seeing a need. It's just remarkable. I don't know that a judge today could get away with that. Maybe. It has me wondering, though.
Well, yeah, please try. Yeah.
So just a little bit more on Lee, and you lay out all the details in the book. But Lee proceeds on a parallel track with the Wallace case. DOJ is completely joined at this point, fully committed to the project. Lee itself keeps expanding. So how does Lee expand and ultimately become foundational to statewide injunctive relief?
Well, Governor Wallace's obstruction of federal court orders led to this burning bush moment for Fred Gray. And so he moved to require the governor and the State Board of Education to integrate all of the schools in the state. And that led to a hearing in November of 1966, which I spent a great deal of time preparing a large cast of lawyers and paralegals and clerical people to prepare for that trial. So that's how.
So you heard the I.
For the
It's
first
rare to
time.
get Mr. Landsberg to acknowledge his role, but really, I said he was in the fray. He's present at essentially all of this. And so you can't, I think in the index, it says Brian K. Landsberg, and you can find the references to where he admits to his particular role, and it's important to call those out, because he knows where he speaks. He was there, he's gathered other primary materials to piece together the entire record. So Lee goes on for quite some time.
We prevailed. So we filed a brief in December, I forget, or January of 1967, and the court issued an order requiring a statewide desegregation, and that then led to all of the school systems in the state that were not already under court order being brought into this case, and a series of proceedings to desegregate those school systems.
And we'll talk about the effect in just a moment, but is the Lee case closed?
Amazingly, no. Anthony Lee, who is now, I think, in his 70s, is still the named plaintiff in this case, and there are still a few school districts where the case has not yet been closed. So you can, Levine-Macon County Board of Education, if you look on the Department of Justice website, the Civil Rights Division still lists some of those cases as open.
Not unusual for a big federal civil rights injunctive relief case for the remedies phase to go on and on and on. But we're going to talk about the effect that Lee has had. But before we turn to that, I just want to focus some more on the players, the people, and just draw out a little bit more about them, because these things only happen because people make decisions or happen to be in the place where they have an opportunity to make a difference. So we've talked a bit about the plaintiffs' lawyers and their clients. We've talked about Fred Gray and Charles Gamillion. I just wanted to draw out one other player. The NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, was active litigating with the plaintiffs. And do you remember who the NAACP assigned to serve as co-counsel?
They sent a lawyer named Constance Baker Motley, who was the co-counsel with Fred Gray, was a corresponding member of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, but she was a lawyer who working for Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So she was at the original hearings in the case. She later became a federal district judge in New York for many years, very distinguished judge.
Yep. So she was in the room when it happened. We've talked a bit about Frank Johnson. Anything more you want to say about him? Just a remarkable man, made for that moment, I think. Again, doing things that it's hard for federal judges today to think about doing. He clearly engaged in ex parte contact with the DOJ. And for lawyers in the room, that's considered verboten, I think.
Yes. He formed a close friendship with my boss, John Doerr, who became the Assistant Attorney General for, became the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And they were very similar, sort of tall white guys with blue eyes and ramrod straight military bearing, very stringent, strict people, and both of them very committed to the rule of law and to ending the racial caste system, which John saw when he started bringing voting rights cases, and he deeply understood them. And Frank Johnson, one of his cases when he was U.S. Attorney in Birmingham involved slavery. An African American had been enslaved by a plantation owner in Alabama, and the man tried to run away. He was caught and beaten to death. And the sheriff wouldn't bring a murder charge, but Frank Johnson brought a slavery charge against him, which was the only federal charge he could bring. And he got really one of the very few convictions for a civil rights violation in the Deep South before he became a federal judge. So he certainly knew the racial caste system very well, also from his work on voting rights cases in Macon County and elsewhere.
And then the government lawyers. You've just mentioned John Doerr. And you point out that this is a story of where government lawyers, it appears, can do some real good. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk a bit more about that and expand on whether or not the Department of Justice ever blanched at the notion of being appointed as a party by the judge on his own initiative.
It began actually in Little Rock when Little Rock was desegregated, and the governor, the governor's actions really led there. Governor Fauba's actions there led to rioting and the closing of the schools. The judge there asked the Department of Justice to come in and help enforce his order. And there was a similar order in New Orleans, one that had similar problems. So the Department of Justice was accustomed to coming into cases to help enforce federal court orders. What was different in Macon County was that Judge Johnson wanted more from us than just enforcing his order. He wanted help in designing the order, and secondly, in monitoring compliance with the order. So the role of the department expanded considerably in the Macon County case, and this was before the Congress, which had been dragging its feet on civil rights legislation, before the Congress had authorized the department to bring school desegregation cases.
But really, it's clear they embraced the goal of dismantling the racial caste system, and their internal memos and discussions and, figuring out how can we do this. But based on your telling, it doesn't sound as if there was ever any serious question about whether or not the DOJ should step in and should fulfill the role, as you said earlier, because that's what Judge Johnson wants.
The Attorney General, Attorney General Kennedy wanted the department to take an active role in desegregation case and was sort of disappointed when he learned that we did not have the statutory authority. And he authorized the bringing of some suits to test whether we could bring suits on our own, and those cases we were all thrown out. So he certainly was supportive of our coming into the case as well.
Now, later on, I just want to note, as you point out, the administration, who is the executive, who's president, can make a difference. And so some of these cases start under Truman. There's Eisenhower, there's Kennedy, Johnson. Johnson makes huge strides in terms of the development of the law, but the numbers aren't necessarily improving greatly. And then President Nixon is elected. And you're faced with a question of whether or not you're going to stay at the Department of Justice. You decide to. You head the school desegregation section. Can you just talk a little bit about how you navigated that period?
Sure. Well, we were very worried because President Nixon in his campaign had engaged in what was called a Southern strategy, trying to get the Deep South to vote Republican, which of course it now does. So we were concerned that he would not support school desegregation cases. And indeed, in the summer of 1969, he ordered the Department of Justice to withdraw motions to desegregate some Mississippi school districts. That led to a big uproar, including a Supreme Court order sort of slapping him down and saying, you have to do it. And so after that, he really turned around and decided that the only way out for him was to get the desegregation over with. So by this time, Levy-Macon County Board of Education had led to the statewide order, and his advisors said to him, the way to get it over with is to bring statewide suits in all of the Deep South states. So that's when the education section that I was the head of brought suits in Georgia and Mississippi and Arkansas, other states, seeking statewide relief, really based on what happened in Levy-Macon County Board of Education. And so Nixon gets the credit for the most desegregation ever to occur in our country occurred on his watch, whether he liked it or not.
If you look at the facts bear that statement out. There's also this ratchet principle, which you talk about at the beginning of the book, and then you just briefly give people a preview of what you mean by that.
Well, I mean that by the ratchet principle, that once the administration takes a position, of course another administration can change it. But if it's taking a position in court and the court agrees with it, it becomes hard to. So President Truman pressed for desegregation in Brown v. Board of Education. President Eisenhower was not real happy about that. But when the Supreme Court asked the Department of Justice for its views in Brown v. Board of Education, he didn't think he could backtrack on what Truman had argued. So then, when President Johnson, under President Johnson, the Department of Justice had filed seeking desegregation of multiple school districts. The Nixon administration, when it did try to go back, quickly found that the political and legal costs were too great. So I think that shows, yes, it is difficult. It's not impossible. It's done, but it's not impossible.
I also love the quote you include from one of Nixon's biographers, which provides another possible explanation that perhaps he was yielding to his occasionally well-concealed desire to do the right thing. We won't spend more time on George Wallace, but I think, again, something you quote, the Montgomery Advertiser, one of the newspapers at the time, put it best when, with his antics, he really provided the impetus for the lawsuits and the expansion of the lawsuits. They referred to the governor's granitic stupidity leading to federalization. So just a few other questions, and then we'll take questions from you for a few moments. I just want to wrap up by reviewing why write about the case now. You observe that the Lee case is a valuable lens through which to view history. What is its most important legacy?
Well, I've written elsewhere that we're in the midst of a struggle for the control of memory. And that if a David Irving can deny the Holocaust, so some future historians are going to deny or try to explain away the United States record of racial discrimination. And I think that full understanding of what happened in Alabama in the 1960s provides a better base for evaluating racial segregation today. So I try to show the intensity of the effort to maintain a white supremacy system, caste system, and also try to show the better side of our country and what we did to overcome that racial caste system, including the use of the federal government. And I'm very proud of the work of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and would like the country to know that the Department of Justice can do good things.
And if you look at the legacy of Lee, even though the case is still open with respect to some districts, as Brian explains in the book, Alabama now has the least segregated schools in the country, right?
That's what the statistics show, yeah.
In
I mean,
19
they're not great. I don't say that they're great, but
But still, and you include a comparison, I just want to make certain folks in this room here. So in 1968, 78.8% of black students in Alabama attended blacks-only schools. By 1970, 36.5% were attending majority white schools. That was up from 8.6%, so a huge leap. It's still about a third. What's California's percentage? 8%. 8%. A lot of the focus has been in the South, but I don't know if you're suggesting that that's something that young lawyers today, or lawyers young enough still to be litigating, should pick up on. What are the lessons for lawyers in the field? Could someone have the same experience that you had today?
well, I think that we see that the law can be a tool for eradicating the racial caste system. And I think that even though we no longer have an official racial caste system, we do in many ways still have a cultural racial caste system. And I think that there are ways that the law can be brought to bear to deal with that. And so, yes, I would encourage lawyers today to look at the current situation, figure out how to attack it. I think it can be done.
And this could be a playbook.
Absolutely.
It gives you inspiration in terms of what folks were doing in the 1960s and 70s. So with that, we'd like to take questions from you for a few moments at least. Judge Tochterman. It sounds like that's the plan, yes. Dean? That's right, we have a live stream.
What was the Justice Department's position on the speed with which desegregation should be ended? I mean, all deliberate speed was the ultimate order, but what was the Department of Justice's position on that?
Well, it evolved. Actually, the brief the Eisenhower administration filed was the basis for the all deliberate speed doctrine. So that was the initial. But by the time that we entered Levy-Macon County Board of Education, we were pushing for doing it as quickly as possible, and the number of grades that would be covered, we tried to expand it into all of the grades very quickly, and also expand it from initially desegregation just meant allowing a few black kids to go to white schools. But really what it should have meant was that there not be white schools, not be black schools, but there be just schools, as the Supreme Court said in 1968. And that was based on arguments the Department of Justice had made in a case in the Supreme Court.
But it took 14, 15 years for the Supreme Court to say,
Yes.
now is the time. Yes.
Brian and Your Honor, are you surprised that voting rights remain extremely contentious and perhaps under their most serious attack since the 1960s?
Absolutely. I'm sort of shocked. I thought that we had taken care of that and it was over with. And it's now that, I thought that our country had accepted the need for a democratically elected government, and that meant that people had to be guaranteed the right to vote. So I've been shocked by the efforts to cut back on the right to vote.
And a federal judge says no comment.
And Dorothy and I are teaching a class in the spring called Voting Rights Then and Now.
So can you all sign up? Yes.
Quick question. I recall that when Central High in Little Rock was ordered desegregated, that the governor closed down the public schools and the white children went to parochial school. And I'm curious whether the same kind of thing happened where you were, if that was a prevalent pattern.
In Macon County, a private school was established after desegregation was ordered, and Governor Wallace got the legislature to vote to give tuition grants to the white students who went to that school. And I was actually the lawyer in the case to strike down those tuition grants. But there were repeated efforts, and throughout the Deep South, so-called segregation academies were created, and some of them probably still exist today. The public schools in the Deep South are struggling. Actually, maybe throughout the country. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Yes,
Please,
for the,
please, Dan.
because we do have folks listening on Zoom, to make certain they can hear.
Of course, during that time, there were a lot of people in Alabama, I'm sure, who were not very happy with what you were doing, what Fred Gray was doing, what Judge Johnson was doing. And we know that there was violence that occurred during the Civil Rights era. So what was it like being down there? How much time did you spend down there? For you and the people you were working with, what was it like working in that environment?
Well, first of all, I have to say that for Fred Gray and Judge Johnson, who lived there, it was quite fraught. There was an effort to bomb the judge's mother's house, as I recall, and his son, who had died at an early age, his son's grave was desecrated. And Fred Gray, like all African-American civil rights, people who were supporting civil rights were under constant threat. It wasn't nearly that way. I mean, I would come down, I spent 180 days in Alabama. I guess that was the most I ever spent there. So I was staying in hotels. I could have my meals at the Air Force Base. So it wasn't really as difficult for us. I mean, we had to be careful, that's all. But I never really had anything bad, terribly bad happen.
All right, one more question, and then we have other business.
Brian, did you ever experience reverse discrimination where then the African-American public resented that you were a white lawyer, not a African-American lawyer?
I have to tell you, Karen, Dorothy would love to tell you this, but Dorothy and I, our first date was in Montgomery, Alabama, and we went to an African-American nightclub called the Lacos Club, which is social spelled backwards, and with another couple. And so there were 4 whites in this all-black nightclub, and people couldn't have been kinder to us. They surrounded us with love, is what I would say. And there were times when I would say it took a while to generate some trust. But no, we never experienced any kind of reverse problems.
And you write in the book how the Department of Justice lawyers, including John Doerr, worked really hard to build trust.
Yes.
Yeah. So another reason that Macon County is close to Brian Landsberg's heart. At this point, we need to bring our part of the program to a close, but please join me in thanking Brian Landsberg for the work he did and the book he's written. You're going to get embarrassed. Thank you, thank you. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce someone else who knows a bit about civil rights. He began his lawyerly career focusing on workers' rights. He's keenly aware of the rights of all persons to housing, to adequate mental health care. Most recently, probably, he's wrestled with what racial justice means, given Sacramento's experiences, including with the difficult Stephon Clark case and many other incidents that challenge those of us here to consider what level of equality and justice we have attained in Sacramento and what more we must do. I used to take credit or accept full responsibility for this young man because he succeeded me on the city council, but that's too long ago now, so he's fully responsible for all of his actions. It was 30 years ago this month that I turned the city council seat over to you. A man who needs no introduction, really, Mayor Darrell Steinberg. I think that's where the mayor is supposed to stand.
So,
Is that right?
first of all, Your Honor, the program says that I only get 3 to 4 minutes to describe the lifetime contributions of Brian and Dorothy Landsberg, and I would like to object to that.
I'm running the stopwatch.
Because 3 or 4 minutes does not do justice, not only to what we have heard tonight, but what Brian and Dorothy have dedicated their entire lives to in Sacramento. I have several thoughts. I'll keep it within my time frame. First of all, revolution by law is a very profound title. And I want to thank you. I've read half the book. I'm not done yet. Okay, I'm not done yet, but I will. I want to thank you for reminding us that, first of all, great change is not a 90-minute television movie, that it is complex, that there are no straight lines, that temporary defeats, big steps forward, you look back over 10 and 50 years and say, look what happened to the schools in the state of Alabama and how much change was made. And that every era has its George Wallaces and people like him. And to know that in this day and age where tweets and calling people out and violence and all the rest of it, that there still is the potential to overcome by using peaceful means, by using the law and the courts to continue the fight for civil rights is very comforting to me. And I think to everybody who had the opportunity to hear you tonight and who will read the book. So just on that, thank you. The second thing is Dorothy and Brian. Strength and humility. It would be easy, I suppose, to define your greatest life achievement around what Brian describes in the book, in his other books, in his years with the United States Department of Justice, helping to lead the Civil Rights Revolution. But Brian, who said 18 years ago when he was given his first Lifetime Achievement Award in Sacramento, described his childhood as being optimistic, that he was optimistic and impressionable, and that he was taught fairly early in life that this Jewish notion that is common to all of our faiths of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, even though he didn't use that term back then, was to be a lifetime commitment. So it is what Brian and Dorothy have done since the 1960s in Sacramento that brings so many friends and so many people watching here tonight to honor you. Whether it is Dorothy's work here at McGeorge and in the community to establish the homelessness advocacy clinic here to help people who have so little clear their records so that they can qualify for benefits or for a job or for housing. How many hundreds of people have you helped? To deciding that the obligation, your obligation, is to pass on all you know to the next generation by organizing at our synagogue a 6th grade interactive conversation about race, 11 and 12-year-olds, because that's where the attitudes begin to form for good or for bad. Or whether what you have done together to not just welcome Ukrainian refugees and other refugees to this country, but actually organizing the community's response and to take a family in and to make sure that they are welcomed and that we are a model for how to welcome the stranger among us. And Brian, I really think about the fact that 18 years ago you were honored for a lifetime achievement, and it's 18 years later and you're still achieving. And it's represented by this incredible work that you have talked about today. You both are still active players in the efforts for social justice in our community and in our country. And you do it in a very unassuming way. This must be a little uncomfortable for you. And that it is why we all love you so much. Thank you. Congratulations.
Good luck. Brace yourself. It's going to be a bumpy night. I'm Larry Levine. I am a professor here at McGeorge School of Law. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. But much more importantly, I fluctuate between being the eldest Landsberg child and the eldest Landsberg grandchild. Both of them are really good gigs to have. So I'm just thrilled to be able to talk a little bit about and really thank Mayor Steinberg and Judge Mueller for honoring us with their presence tonight. It means so very much. And we're equally honored to have Brian and Dorothy as such central members of the McGeorge Law School community. We even get to claim Dorothy Landsberg as an alumna of this law school. We are the luckiest law school in America for that very reason. I have really struggled with what to say about Dorothy and Brian in the limited amount of time allotted to me. I really worried that my remarks would seem hyperbolic, that no two people could be as incredibly grand and extraordinary as I and others who have spoken this evening say. And then I realized, you all know them. You believe in this, right? You know this is so. So instead, I've decided to fret that my comments will just be inadequate.
because I won't be able to express how your many, many accomplishments and how extraordinary your lives have been. It's been said that behind every great woman is a good man, or something like that. And so I'm going to say that Brian is that good and decent man to Dorothy, and what a team the two of you have become. We've heard a bit about Brian and his extraordinary book. So I'm going to chat a bit about that great woman, the tireless, extraordinarily generous, brilliant, supremely competent, huge-hearted, champion of social justice, and yes, McGeorge alum Dorothy Shelton Landsberg. And there's not time to do much justice for the many things that, Dorothy, you've accomplished in your life, but I just want to mention a few. First, that at a very young age, you went to work for Assistant Attorney General John Doerr in the Civil Rights Division, where you worked on voting rights, on school desegregation, and even tracking the activities of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. Then you became allegedly, and I say allegedly intentionally, a paralegal at the highly regarded law firm of Shea and Gardner. But it seems to me that anyone who knows Dorothy knows that she did as much, if not more, than any lawyers at that law firm. And in fact, it begs the question, is there a statute of limitations on practicing law without a license? Ultimately, you wound up in 1974 working for the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee Impeachment Committee, and this led to the removal of a corrupt president. This seems particularly meaningful today, and so I suggest you keep your phone handy. The mayor touched on some of the extraordinary things that you've done for the law school. We're so lucky that you came here to study law, that Brian brought you here. Your presence means so very, very much to so many of us. You did extraordinary work at the highly regarded firm of Chronic Moskowitz, becoming a partner. And here at the law school, you took on the often thankless task of being the associate dean. And we're so grateful that you and Brian continue to educate the students at this law school. Now, I think Brian and Dorothy's greatest legacy is the nurturing of their children and grandchildren. And as I mentioned, that I feel a part of that group. It wasn't that surprising to me when I mentioned this event to celebrate Brian's book and the creation of a scholarship to honor Brian and Dorothy's countless contributions to McGeorge, to Sacramento, and frankly, to humanity. They initially balked. And so I pushed back a little and I implored them to reconsider. And once I had their approval, one of them, I won't mention which one, but one of them, with her usual organizational skills, passion, did everything she could to ensure that this event tonight would be a remarkable one, and that it would prove to be a success. Also, unsurprisingly, when I asked them what this scholarship should be for, without missing a beat, the two of them immediately responded, the answer being racial justice. Given their lifelong commitment to civil rights, it only seems right. They have worked so hard to bring about a more just society. Indeed, their work at the Civil Rights Division not only contributed to that result, but it also contributed to them meeting, dating, marrying, raising children, and because they're traditionalists in that order. I have often referred to Brian and Dorothy as the Jewish Waltons. And those of you who are old enough might remember that television show, which was about a family where love abounded and where the children actually talked to their parents. My friend Victor suggested that a more current reference might be to think of Brian and Dorothy as modern day Ted Lassos. And I think that seems to me to be quite right, because they inspire all of us who know them to be better humans by their goodness, their energy, and their empathy. So thus, it's an enormous honor tonight to be able to launch officially the Brian and Dorothy Racial Justice Scholarship here at McGeorge. It will be given to entering and continuing students who are committed to using their legal education to further racial justice. And I'm particularly pleased that in the month that we've been talking about this scholarship, we've already raised over $50,000, which is not bad, huh? And by raising $50,000, that means that this scholarship will go on into perpetuity, and that every dollar donated is matched dollar for dollar from the Powell Fund at the University of the Pacific. So yes, it's a good start. It won't surprise you to hear me say that it's my hope that by the end of this calendar year, we'll have raised $100,000. So 2023 begins with a corpus of $200,000 in this scholarship. If you wanted to join me or the dean or several of the others who have contributed, we would not say no. I am so pleased that Brian and Dorothy gave in and were willing to be part of this event tonight. It means more to me than I can say. And in fact, it's hard to get through this because I just adore and admire you both so very much. On behalf of all of us who are assembled here in person and remotely, and on behalf of the countless other persons whose lives you've touched, we thank and we honor you. I hope that you feel surrounded by love tonight. So with that, please join me in welcoming Brian and Dorothy to the podium.
So this is hard for both of us. There's so many people in this room we love and so many people on Zoom. And so we're going to try to get through a few words of gratitude for me without crying. So a commitment to furthering racial justice and McGeorge School of Law are central in our lives. So we feel blessed to be able to bring together that commitment and this excellent institution. We thank Professor Levine, our cherished friend and esteemed colleague, who had a vision that a book talk could become a racial justice celebration. And we deeply appreciate our outstanding dean for the courage and competence to lead the McGeorge community as it strives to become an anti-racist law school. And many thanks to Cassandra, Sally, and Chris and others for making this event a success. I would also like to honor two colleagues who have inspired me. Melissa Brown, the clinical director of the McGeorge Community Legal Services, a dedicated and skilled public interest attorney and excellent teacher, whose leadership helped to make the Homeless Advocacy Clinic a reality. And together we honor Steve Pollack, the former Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, an extraordinary public servant, our mentor and role model, and our beloved friend of 55+ years. Steve, we thank you. In closing, why are we motivated to work for racial justice? It's due to the values and the work ethic of our parents, none of whom had a simple, easy life. To the loving support of our siblings, to our 3 amazing children, each of whom lives a life of service and meaning, and to our 4 grandchildren who inspire us to work for a more just world. We thank you.
And I've already had most of my say, but I would like to add a little bit more gratitude, first to Anthony Lee and the other brave students throughout the country who've challenged racial discrimination in public schools. And then I thank many people in the acknowledgments in my book, and I want to thank, I don't want to name them all now, but I don't know whether Rob Gunnison is here, yes. Rob and Jade Walensky, especially who got me through the most difficult part of the book. And to my students who have inspired me to understand more deeply how the law can operate to dismantle the racial caste system. I want to thank Darrell Steinberg, who exemplifies the saying that it is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either. And to Dorothy. And finally, to Judge Mueller, whom I have admired since her service many years ago. I now know the number on the Sacramento City Council. She's an inspiration to us all, as well as a friend. Thank you all.
So if I may, I'm going to go out of order and call our dear friend, Paul Hancock, who came here unexpectedly from Miami, esteemed colleague in the Civil Rights Division, a friend of many years, who has a wonderful story to tell about Brian Landsberg as his mentor. And I know you want to get to that reception that's out there, and I'm calling to Paul without any knowledge, but I really think it's a story worth telling about Brian and his brief and the discussion you had afterwards about the role of the lawyers.
Actually, I didn't know that this was happening either, but Paul is quoted in my book.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what story Dorothy's talking about.
You can tell any story, Paul.
Well, I'll just be really brief. I joined the Civil Rights Division in 1970, and Brian tells the story about what was happening at the time, and it was right after the Supreme Court had slapped down the department for seeking to delay school desegregation, and that case was Alexander v. Holmes, the Supreme Court decision. And because of that, the Civil Rights Division at the time was just moving to a new system of organization where they were going to be organized by subject matter rather than geography. And Brian was selected to be the head of the education section, but very few of the experienced lawyers wanted to do school desegregation work because they were so pissed off at the administration. So a lot of us young people came in right out of law school, and we were assigned to work for Brian, and we were sent to the field immediately. I mean, I was sent to Memphis the first day I joined the division, and we were going, Brian talked about Levy-Macon. There were some 99 school districts, is that right, Brian, joined as defendants, individual school districts, and it was not just a legal issue, it was a question of you had to draw plans to decide who was going to go to what school. And it was really the first time in the South that students were being signed based on where they lived, and they had to live in the old-fashioned neighborhood schools, and it had a lot of side issues, like what would be the racial composition of the schools. There weren't computers to do that. Research analysts would draw maps, we'd call student locator maps, where they'd put a dot on the map according to the race of the student and then count them up to see where they would go. And there were side issues with it, like what was going to happen to teachers. When schools were desegregated, suddenly they didn't want the black teachers teaching white students, so they dismissed all the black teachers. And there were lawsuits filed that Brian led that led to rehiring teachers. There were sports issues. What was going to happen to the sports teams? What was going to happen to the proms? Were they going to be integrated? So there were huge issues, and Brian led a team of lawyers that we were all young. We really didn't know very much about what we were doing, and we were sent into the field with Brian behind the desk with, not just Levy-Macon was 99 separate cases that were very intense, but there was also Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, all had the same kind of thing going. So he was a remarkable, remarkable leader who we would wait in line to go into his office to talk about what should the plan be for this school district. And we would go over it individually, and Brian would remember every one of them and what the arguments. And he knew what arguments we should make, what we should tell that we should make. And the one he tells in the story about me was, and I'll tell it if you get to the book, is that what you're talking about, Dorothy, that one? About when I was trying my first case in the Anniston, Alabama school district, and Brian told me, because of the judge I was certainly going to lose this case, and I better make a good record for the Court of Appeals, because we weren't going to win in the district court. And I had been working hard on this case, and I was working with the judge, and I thought I was going to win this case. The judge liked me. He was a big Auburn football fan, and I was from Ohio, and I would talk to him at conferences about Big Ten football and Notre Dame football, and he would talk about Auburn football, and we really hit it off. And he told the U.S. attorney that he liked me because I argued with witnesses. And I told Brian when I finally revealed this story, it would be just a trait you wouldn't like about me. You wouldn't want me doing that in the courtroom. But this judge seemed to like me for that. And when the case was being tried, Brian came down the night before the trial to teach me how to try a case. It was kind of late. It was the night before the trial. But during the trial, the judge called a recess, and he said to me, Mr. Hancock, would you come up to the podium? I'd like to talk with you. And Brian and the U.S. attorney jumped up to come with me to protect me from this old racist judge in Birmingham. Clarence Allgood, his name was. And the judge said, no, I don't want anyone else to come up. I want just Mr. Hancock to come up. And so I went up there, and the judge said to me, and I'll use his words because they're the same words that are in Brian's books, and he said, Mr. Hancock, did you know that Auburn has a Negra on their football team this year? And I said, yes, Judge, I knew that. And he said, yeah, everything seems to be going really well. The fans all cheer when he scores a touchdown, and everything seems to be going real well. So I went back and slumped down at the counsel table, and Brian and the U.S. attorney came over to me and said, what'd he say? And all I could say to them was, you're right, we're going to lose this case. And we did. And we went to the Court of Appeals and we won. But I've known, and Dorothy, you could talk about Dorothy just as long as you can talk about Brian. And one more story about Dorothy was she went to the Library of Congress, didn't you, to research the language for the closing argument and the Klan's trial, that you researched the language of the closing arguments in Nuremberg trial, is that right? To come up with the language that John Doerr was going to use?
That's the story. There's a slightly different version, but yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I love these people. Brian was my mentor. He's my role model. They both are really, they're icons in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Just icons in the Civil Rights Division. Thank you.
So with that extra treat, I have just a couple of final orders of business. First of all, for many of you who are sitting at the table, you will notice something that you could scan your phone to if you would like to make a donation to the scholarship. We've arranged to make it very easy to do so. So we've set that up for you, but you can stop any of us. I also do want to thank, and it's sort of repetitive of what Dorothy said, the McGeorge folks who helped organize the event, in addition to Larry, Cassandra Fernandez back there. She'll wave at you. She's the Assistant Dean for Alumni Relations and Fundraising and Events. She's got like really 3 jobs. Quentin Graber, who is the Director of Development for the law school, right over there. He gave you a wave. Sally Pereira, who looks at me like, why are you embarrassing me publicly? But does a lot of the critical back-end stuff for the law school. I also have a small order of business. If you are a McGeorge student, a generous donor in the room who asked to be kept anonymous but happens to be someone I adore, has paid for you to have a free copy of the book. And so if you're a McGeorge student, all you have to do is just let Cassandra know, Dean Fernandez know, and you will have a copy of the book for yourself. With that, we do have a reception outdoors. I hope you'll all join me. Please join me in just 3 things. First, I want to thank Judge Mueller for her wonderful job moderating the conversation. I want to thank Mayor Steinberg, even though he went to probably, the wrong law school, that other one in the region. He has otherwise been a wonderful supporter of the law school and a really good friend, and I got to ride a whole flight with him back from Chicago. We had gone to a Cal game recently, and he was actually reading Brian's book as we flew back, and so I tried not to be interesting so that he could focus on the book. And so thank him, and of course I have to thank Dorothy and Brian. It's a joy to get to work with them. It's an education to get to work with them. Even to this day, when we're discussing things as faculties do on our faculty listserv, I look forward to what they're going to contribute to the conversation, and it always is something I wish I had said and wish I'd said so well. So if you all join me in playing them one last time, and then we'll head outdoors. Pardon me? Oh, the reception is right over here. So right.